The stagecoach bucked one last time, groaning like a dying man before lurching to a final, dust-choked halt. Through the grimy window, Ilara Vance saw Redemption Creek. It was less a town and more a wound in the hide of the earth. A collection of tired, unpainted buildings hunkered down under a vast and indifferent sky. Dust, the color of old bones, coated everything, stirred into lazy funnels by a wind that carried no relief from the biting heat. She stepped down onto the hard-packed dirt, her legs trembling from exhaustion and days of being jostled in the cramped coach. Every muscle ached, a dull throb that was a constant companion. But it was nothing compared to the deeper ache of fear that had taken root in her soul. She clutched the thin strap of her reticule, the few remaining coins inside a pathetic weight against her palm. It was all that was left of her flight from Philadelphia, from a life that had promised silks and society but had delivered only the cold terror of a gilded cage. The memory of Philip's face, handsome and cruel, flashed behind her eyes. His voice, a cultured whisper that could turn to a venomous snarl in an instant, still echoed in her ears. She had run, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the terror he had instilled in her. Run until the green hills of Pennsylvania were a distant memory, and the world had become this endless expanse of brown earth and bleached sky. Redemption Creek offered no welcome. The faces that turned to watch her alight from the coach were as hard and unforgiving as the landscape. Women peered from behind twitching curtains, their eyes narrowed with suspicion. Men leaning against the porch posts of the saloon paused their whittling to stare, their gazes slow and invasive, making her feel as exposed as if her worn calico dress were threadbare. There was no kindness here, only a raw, judgmental scrutiny that pricked at her skin. The town was a mirror of the wilderness that surrounded it, beautiful in a stark, brutal way, but utterly without mercy for the weak. Her meager funds vanished like water on the hot dust. The proprietor of the only boarding house, a grim-faced woman with a mouth set in a permanent line of disapproval, charged a price that was pure extortion. 2 days, and the coins in Ilara's reticule were gone. Hunger became a familiar gnawing in her belly. She sought work, her voice barely a whisper as she inquired at the general store, the small eatery, even the livery. She was met with slammed doors and curt dismissals. A woman alone, with no husband and no family to speak for her, was an object of immediate suspicion, a problem nobody wanted. The whispers followed her down the single dusty street. She was a runaway, a woman of low morals, a fool for coming to such a place unprepared. Each cold stare, each muttered comment, chipped away at her resolve, leaving her raw and teetering on the edge of despair. Homelessness was no longer a distant fear. It was a shadow lengthening at her heels. It was in the general store, while pretending to examine a bolt of cloth she could never afford, that she first heard the name. 2 women, their faces pinched with gossip, were talking in low, conspiratorial tones. "Heard the Thorn Man was down at the pastor's place again," one said, her voice a reedy hiss. "Looking for another one." "Lord have mercy," the other woman clucked, shaking her head. "After what happened to the last girl they sent up there, ran screaming back to town inside of a week, looking like she'd seen the devil himself. Said he never spoke a word, just stared, like a predator." "He is a predator," the first woman insisted. "The beast of the ridge, that's what my Jed calls him. Living up there all alone with whatever dark things fester in his mind. It ain't natural. No decent woman would go near him." Ilara felt a cold dread trickle down her spine. The beast of the ridge. The name was a monstrous thing, spoken with a mixture of fear and relish. She learned more in the days that followed, piecing together the town's bogeyman from scraps of overheard conversation. Elias Thorne was a recluse, a mountain man who lived miles from town in the high, lonely wilderness. They said he was a giant, impossibly strong and half-wild. Years ago, some terrible violence had befallen his family, and he had been left horribly scarred, his face a ruin that could frighten children and curdle milk. He was a creature of rumor and legend, a convenient monster to blame for spooked livestock or strange noises in the night. just as her last hope was flickering out. A boy found her sitting on a bench outside the small, sun-bleached church. "Pastor Miller wants to see you," he mumbled, kicking at the dirt before running off as if her presence might be contagious. With nothing left to lose, Alara smoothed her dress and entered the cool, dim interior of the church. Pastor Miller was not what she expected. He was a man worn smooth by the harshness of his flock and their unforgiving land. His eyes were pragmatic, his shoulders stooped with a weary resignation. He did not offer platitudes or prayers. He offered a proposition. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice dry as dust, "I am aware of your predicament. This is a hard town for a woman on her own." Alara could only nod, her throat too tight for words. "There may be a solution," he continued, steepling his fingers on his worn wooden desk. "It is unconventional." He paused, his gaze steady and direct. "Mr. Elias Thorne is in need of a woman to manage his homestead, to cook, to clean, to be a wife to him." The word struck Alara like a physical blow. Wife, to the monster, the beast of the ridge. A choked sound of protest escaped her lips. "No local woman will have him," the pastor said, cutting off her objection before it could be fully formed. "They are spooked by his appearance, by his silence. But he is a man of property. His homestead is well established. He is not a poor man." He leaned forward slightly. "He is willing to pay. He has authorized me to offer a sum that would not only clear any debts you may have incurred at the boarding house, but would provide you with a substantial amount for your own security. It would be yours, legally, upon the signing of the marriage certificate." He named the figure. Alara gasped. It was a small fortune, more money than she had ever seen. It was safety. It was a future. It was a life raft in the middle of a vast, drowning ocean. But the price was monstrous. To chain herself to a man the entire town feared. To live in complete isolation, miles from another living soul, in the clutches of a scarred, silent beast. The memory of Philip's handsome face and the terror it concealed rose in her mind. Was a scarred face worse than a beautiful one that hid a devil? She had no way of knowing. "He requires a wife in name only," the pastor clarified, as if sensing the direction of her thoughts. "A housekeeper, a presence in the home. He asks for nothing more. You would be safe. You would be provided for. It is a better fate, I assure you, than starving on the street." He was right. Survival was a brutal, simple arithmetic. Her fear of Elias Thorne was a fear of the unknown. Her fear of starvation was immediate and absolute. With a heart like a stone in her chest, Alara gave her answer. It was a single, whispered word that felt like a death sentence and a pardon all at once. Yes, the journey was a punishment. A taciturn man named Silas was paid to guide her, though his willingness ended 5 miles from the homestead itself. "This is as far as I go," he announced, pulling his mule to a halt where the faint track disappeared into a thick stand of pine. "His land starts here. Follow the creek. You cannot miss the cabin." He refused to meet her eyes, as if afraid of what he might see in them. He unloaded her single, small trunk, took his money, and left without a backward glance, the jingle of his mule's harness fading into the oppressive silence. Alara was utterly alone. The wilderness was beautiful, but its beauty was merciless. Towering peaks clawed at the sky, their stone faces ancient and impassive. The wind whispered through the pines, a lonely, sighing sound that seemed to speak of ages of solitude. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth, sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. This was his world, the beast's world. She was a trespasser, small and fragile, and with every step she took, the town of Redemption Creek and everything she had ever known felt farther away than the moon. The cabin appeared so suddenly it seemed to grow from the earth. It was nestled in a small clearing, a sturdy structure of thick, dark logs, with a stone chimney breathing a thin plume of smoke into the crisp air. It looked solid, permanent, It looked like a cage. And then he was there. He stepped out from behind the cabin, and the breath caught in her throat. The town's gossip had not been an exaggeration. He was a giant of a man, with shoulders as broad as an ox yoke and hands that seemed large enough to crush stone. But it was his face that made her want to scream and run. The left side was a terrible ruin of scarred tissue. The skin pulled tight and shiny, twisting his mouth into a permanent, silent snarl and drawing one eye slightly wider than the other. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace. His eyes, one clear and blue, the other clouded by the scar tissue, fixing on her with an intensity that rooted her to the spot. He did not speak. He simply stood there, watching her. He grunted, a low, guttural sound, and gestured with one massive hand toward the cabin. It was a clear command. Go inside. Terror, cold and absolute, seized her. She could not move, could not think. This was a mistake, a fatal, terrible mistake. He took a step toward her, and she flinched, a small, pathetic whimper escaping her lips. He stopped. He made the sound again, softer this time, and pointed once more at the door. Her body, moving on its own accord, obeyed. She walked on trembling legs past him and into the cabin. The inside was clean and sparse. A large stone hearth dominated one wall. There was a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a bed in the corner, and shelves holding a few tin plates and cups. It was the home of a man who lived a life stripped down to its barest essentials. He followed her in, his presence seeming to suck all the air from the small space. He gestured to the bed, then to her trunk, her room. Then he pointed to the hearth and the cooking pots. Her duties? He communicated without words, a creature of signs and sounds, and his silence was a heavy, oppressive blanket that smothered all thought. He gave her one last, long look before turning and leaving the cabin, closing the door softly behind him. Alara sank onto the bed, her body shaking uncontrollably, and for the first time since fleeing Philadelphia, she wept, her sobs lost in the vast, profound silence of the mountain. The first days were a trial of unrelenting tension. Alara moved through the cabin like a ghost, her every movement quiet and deliberate, terrified of making a sound that might draw his attention. She performed her duties with a meticulous precision born of fear. She cooked his meals, placing the plate on the table and retreating to her corner while he ate. He ate like he did everything else, silently, his gaze fixed on his food. She cleaned the cabin until the floorboards shone, mended the few shirts he owned, and fetched water from the creek, her heart pounding in her chest every time she had to step outside. And he watched her. It was not a leering gaze, not the way the men in town had looked at her. It was something else, something she could not decipher. While she kneaded dough or swept the floor, she would feel the weight of his stare on her. When she looked up, his strange, mismatched eyes were always on her, his expression unreadable behind the mask of his scars. She mistook his intensity for menace, his silence for a simmering rage. She felt like a mouse being observed by a hawk, constantly on edge, waiting for the moment he would strike. The sturdy cabin, her only shelter from the wilderness, began to feel more like a trap with each passing hour. On the 3rd night, the storm came. It rolled in from the peaks with a sudden, violent fury, the sky turning a bruised purple-black. The wind howled around the cabin, rattling the window panes and clawing at the roof. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound so loud it seemed to split the world in two, and lightning bleached the landscape in stark, terrifying flashes. The storm outside was a reflection of the one inside Alara. Her nerves, already stretched taut for days, began to fray. Each clap of thunder made her jump, her heart hammering against her ribs. It reminded her of Philip's rages, the way his anger would gather and break with a terrifying, destructive force. She was trying to get a ceramic pitcher of water from a high shelf, her hands trembling, when an especially violent crack of thunder shook the very foundations of the cabin. She cried out, a small, startled sound, and her fingers slipped. The pitcher fell, hitting the stone hearth with a sickening crash, shattering into a dozen large pieces in a spray of smaller shards. Ilara froze, her blood turning to ice. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by the drumming of the rain and the howl of the wind. He was sitting at the table, and now he rose slowly to his full, intimidating height. This was it. The silence would be broken. The beast would finally roar. She braced herself for the blow, for the explosion of violence she had been dreading, squeezing her eyes shut and waiting for the inevitable. But it did not come. She dared to open her eyes a crack. Elias was not looking at her with rage. He was looking at the broken pieces on the floor. He walked over, his heavy boots making no sound on the wooden floorboards, and knelt. He did not yell. He did not curse. He simply began to pick up the broken shards of ceramic, his large, calloused hands surprisingly careful, his movements gentle as he gathered even the smallest, sharpest splinters. He placed them all in a pile before fetching a broom and dustpan to sweep up the rest. He did it all without a word, without a single glance in her direction. The lack of an outburst was more shocking than any violence would have been. He finished cleaning, put the pieces in a small box, and then returned to his chair at the table as if nothing had happened. Ilara remained frozen by the hearth, her mind reeling, unable to process what she had just witnessed. Later that night, long after the storm had rumbled its way past and a weary quiet had settled over the mountain, she lay on her bed, staring into the darkness. She could not sleep. When she finally rose to get a drink of water, she saw something on the small table beside her bed. It was a flower. It was carved from a piece of pale wood, no bigger than her palm, but it was perfect. The petals were delicate and impossibly thin, each one curled just so. The leaves were intricately detailed, with tiny veins carved into their surface. It was a work of breathtaking artistry and patience, a thing of impossible beauty. She picked it up. It was smooth and warm in her hand. He must have put it there while she was turned away, a silent offering in the dark. It was not the act of a monster. It was not the gesture of a mindless beast. It was something else entirely, staring at the small, perfect flower, a silent apology and a beautiful, inexplicable gift. Ilara felt the first crack appear in the thick wall of her fear. For the first time, she wondered about the man who lived behind the scars. The wooden flower sat on the table beside her bed, a small, pale ghost in the pre-dawn light. Ilara had not moved it. It felt both like a fragile peace offering and a profound puzzle. The storm had passed, and with it, some of the sharpest edges of her terror had been smoothed away. Fear still lived in the cabin with her, a constant, quiet roommate. But now it was joined by a fragile, budding curiosity. The man who could carve such delicate beauty with his scarred, powerful hands was not the simple monster she had imagined. A new routine settled over them, less a truce and more a careful, silent orbit around one another. The tension remained, a low hum beneath the quiet of their days. But Ilara found herself watching him not with overt fear, but with a cautious, searching gaze. She began to see things she had previously missed, small details that were like chinks in his stone-like facade. Every evening, after he finished his meal, he would gather the scraps of meat and bread onto a flat stone just beyond the cabin door. She had assumed it was for disposal, but one evening, peering through the window, she saw a vixen and two kits, their forms sleek and shadowy in the twilight, emerge from the woods. They ate eagerly from the stone while Elias watched from the doorway, a still and silent guardian. He was feeding them. She discovered a small, hidden clearing a ways down the creek, where a patch of wild columbines grew in a sheltered spot. The earth around them was carefully tended, cleared of weeds and encroaching brush. It was his work. She knew it instinctively. He was cultivating beauty in a place no one else would ever see. And sometimes, when he stood looking out at the distant peaks, his back to her, she would see a profound sadness settle over his massive frame. His shoulders would slump, and the intimidating stillness he carried would transform into a crushing weight of sorrow. In those moments, when he thought he was unobserved, his eyes held a haunted, desolate look that spoke of a pain so deep it had no words. Her greatest discovery came by accident. He had gone out hunting, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm, and she was airing out the cabin's few blankets in the bright, clean sunlight. A small shed she had assumed was for storage stood a short distance from the cabin, its door slightly ajar. A flicker of movement from within caught her eye, a chipmunk darting out. Driven by an impulse she did not fully understand, she pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light that lanced through a grimy window pane. The air smelled of pine and cedar shavings and clean earth, and all around her, on shelves, on barrels, and on the floor, were animals. They were carved from wood, dozens of them, and they were so breathtakingly alive she almost expected them to move. A great hawk, its wings spread wide for flight, talons extended, seemed to scream a silent challenge from its perch on a log. A doe and her fawn were captured in a moment of tender stillness, the fawn's head bent to nuzzle its mother's flank. A wolf, its head thrown back in a silent howl, was so real she could almost feel the vibration in its throat. Each piece was a masterpiece of detail and emotion. He had captured not just their forms, but their spirits, the wildness, the fear, the tenderness, the fury. She reached out a trembling hand to touch the smooth, polished wood of a sleeping fox. Its body curled into a perfect circle of peace. This was his secret. This was the language of the silent man. The carvings were imbued with all the life and feeling he kept locked away inside himself. This shed was not a workshop. It was a sanctuary for his soul. And in that moment, Elara understood that the man she feared, the beast of the ridge, was an artist of profound and delicate genius. The contradiction was so vast, so startling, that it left her dizzy. A week later, their supply of flour and salt had dwindled, forcing a trip to town. Elias simply placed a small deerskin pouch of coins on the table along with a short, scrawled list. It was clear she was to go alone. The thought of facing Redemption Creek again filled her with a familiar dread, but the thought of him trying to navigate that pit of vipers was somehow worse. She took the pouch and the list and made the long trek down the mountain, the memory of the town's cold stares making her steps heavy. The town had not softened. If anything, its judgment had festered. As she entered the general store, a hush fell over the room. The women who had been gossiping near the fabric bolts fell silent, their eyes turning to her, sharp and dissecting. She felt their whispers like insects crawling on her skin. "The beast's property," one muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. "Look at her. Hardly more than a child. A shame what some women will do for a bit of coin." The men were worse. A group of them standing outside the store stopped their conversation to watch her, their expressions a foul mix of pity and crude speculation. One of them spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near her feet. "Heard the beast got himself a wife," he drawled to his companions. "Wonder if he scares her into submission or just breaks her." Their laughter was a harsh, ugly sound that made her stomach clench. She gathered her supplies as quickly as she could, her face burning with shame and anger, her hands shaking as she counted out the coins. She felt utterly alone, a pariah marked by her association with Elias, the cruelty of the townsfolk. Their willful blindness and gleeful malice solidified her sense of alienation. She did not belong with these people, and in a strange, unexpected way, their venom pushed her closer to the silent man on the mountain. His quiet, scarred world, which had once felt like a prison, now seemed a refuge compared to the viciousness of this so-called civilization. As she was loading her purchases into a burlap sack, a woman with kind eyes and hands dusted with soot approached her. "You are Mrs. Thorne, are you not?" she asked, her voice gentle. Elara nodded, bracing for another insult. "I am Martha, the blacksmith's wife." The woman offered a small, hesitant smile. "Do not pay them any mind. Their tongues are sharper than their wits." She glanced around the store, then leaned in closer. "I see the way they look at you, the way they talk. They do not know a thing. They trade in fear because it is cheaper than compassion." Tears pricked at Elara's eyes, a reaction to this small, unexpected crumb of kindness. Martha's expression softened with pity. "Child, do you know what happened to him? Do you know how he came to be as he is?" Elara shook her head. "No one has said—" Martha sighed, a heavy, sorrowful sound. "Then I will. It is only right you should know the truth of the man you are tied to." She led Elara to a bench in the shade of the smithy's awning, the rhythmic clang of her husband's hammer providing a strange counterpoint to her story. It was about 10 years ago. Elias was not always as he is now. He was a good man, a strong man. He smiled more. He had a wife, Sarah. She was a beauty, with hair the color of corn silk, and they had a little boy, Daniel. He was a bright, happy child, not more than 5 years old. She paused, her gaze distant, lost in the memory. They had this homestead, built it with their own hands. They were happy. Then a band of marauders came through these parts, ex-soldiers, mean and hungry, with no soul left in them. They hit the outlying homesteads first. They came upon Elias and his family. He tried to fight them off. Lord, how he must have fought, but there were too many. Martha's voice dropped to a pained whisper. They were brutal. They killed Sarah and the boy right in front of him. And when he would not stop fighting, they held him down. They took a hot brand from his own fire and they did that to his face, to his body. They wanted to mark him, to break his spirit before they killed him. They left him for dead in his burning cabin. Elara felt a wave of nausea. She put a hand to her mouth, the horror of the story, a physical sickness in her belly. A trapping party found him days later, clinging to life by a thread. Martha finished, her eyes filled with tears. He survived, but the man he was, he died up there with his family. What is left is the shell, filled with a grief so big it choked out his words. He is not a monster, child. He is the only one who lived through a horror none of us can imagine. Those scars on his face are nothing compared to the ones on his soul. The world tilted on its axis. The revelation struck Elara with the force of a physical blow, shattering her perception of everything. The man on the mountain was not a beast. He was a survivor, a victim, a husband and father who had been forced to watch his world burn. His silence was not malice. It was a prison of unspeakable grief. His intense gaze was not menace. It was the watchfulness of a man who had lost everything and lived in constant memory of that pain. Her fear, which had been the cornerstone of her existence for weeks, crumbled away, replaced by a wave of deep, aching empathy that was so powerful it took her breath away. The long walk back up the mountain was a pilgrimage. The wilderness no longer seemed threatening, and the cabin no longer felt like a cage. She was returning to a place of profound sorrow, to a man who had suffered the unimaginable. She saw him now not through the lens of her own fear, but through the heartbreaking clarity of Martha's story. Her presence in the cabin began to change. She was no longer just performing duties. She began a quiet, gentle campaign to bring a flicker of life back into the silent, grief-stricken home. She found a patch of worn fabric on one of his work shirts and mended it not with plain, functional stitches, but with a small, careful pattern. When she needed bread, she found herself humming softly, a forgotten tune from her childhood. The simple melody, a small act of defiance against the oppressive silence. She picked a small bouquet of the columbines he tended and placed them in a tin cup on the table. Small gestures, small offerings of peace. She did not know if he noticed, but she did them anyway. It was all she could think to do. A few nights later, she was jolted from a shallow sleep by a sound that was not part of the mountain's nightly chorus. It was a human sound, a terrible, guttural cry of pure agony, ripped from a place of deepest pain. It came from his room. "Sarah!" The name was a raw, ragged scream, followed by a violent thrashing sound that shook the floorboards. Ilara's heart leaped into her throat. The old fear was there, a cold flicker in the dark, but it was instantly overwhelmed by the crushing empathy she now felt for him. He was not raging, he was dreaming. He was reliving it. Without a second thought, she threw back her thin blanket and hurried from her bed. The door to his room was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, she saw his massive form silhouetted by the moonlight pouring through the window. He was sitting bolt upright in his bed, tangled in his sheets, his hands clenched into fists. He was lost, trapped in a nightmare that had been haunting him for a decade. "No!" he moaned, his voice thick with sleep and torment. "Sarah!" He was wild with grief, his scarred face a mask of anguish in the pale light. A younger, more frightened Ilara would have run, but she was no longer that woman. She walked quietly into the room and sat on the very edge of his bed. She did not speak. She did not touch him. She simply sat there, her presence a silent testament in the dark, a small, steady anchor in the violent storm of his memory. Slowly, as if sensing another soul in the room, the thrashing subsided. His ragged breaths began to slow. The tension in his powerful shoulders eased. He was coming out of the dream, emerging from the depths of his own private hell. In the deep, profound quiet that followed, his hand moved across the blanket, searching for something that was not there. His fingers brushed against hers. He flinched, but did not pull away. Then, his hand closed around hers, his grip not rough or threatening, but desperate. The grip of a man clinging to the last solid thing in a world that had dissolved into chaos and pain. It was not a romantic touch. It was something more elemental, a primal, human need for connection in the face of unbearable loneliness. His large, calloused hand, the hand of an artist and a survivor, held her smaller one with a strength that spoke of all his sorrow. And in the shared darkness, for the first time, they were not a master and his housekeeper. They were two profoundly lonely souls, two broken people, sharing a moment of silent, shattering vulnerability. His hand remained around hers until the first pale fingers of dawn touched the window pane. When he finally let go, the absence of his touch was a tangible thing, a sudden coldness in the quiet room. He did not speak of the nightmare, and she did not ask. But the shattering of his composure in the darkness had irrevocably altered the space between them. The silence that morning was different. The heavy, oppressive blanket of unspoken things had been lifted, replaced by a thin, fragile veil of shared vulnerability. The next afternoon, he broke a decade of near-total silence. He was standing at the cabin door, his strange eyes fixed on the clouds gathering over the western peaks. "Snow's coming," he said. His voice was a revelation, a low, rough sound, like stones grinding together, the words stiff and clumsy from disuse. But it was a human voice. Ilara, who had been scrubbing a pot at the hearth, froze, her hands submerged in the soapy water. She looked up at him, her heart giving a sudden, sharp thump against her ribs. He did not look at her, but he had spoken to her. It was a beginning. From that day forward, words began to trickle into their silent world, sparse and deliberate, like the first melt of a frozen river. He began to teach her the ways of the mountain, the secret language of his isolated existence. He taught her how to read the weather and the shape of the clouds and the direction of the wind. He took her into the woods and showed her the plants that could heal, the feathery leaves of the yarrow plant to stop bleeding, the pungent root of the osha for coughs, the bitter bark of the willow for fevers and pain. He spoke of them with a quiet reverence, as if they were old friends. He taught her how to track, showing her the subtle difference between the print of a deer and an elk, how to tell from the depth and shape of a track how long ago the animal had passed. She learned to move quietly, to listen to the whisper of the forest, to see the world not as a backdrop, but as a living, breathing entity. During these lessons, he was a different man. The profound sadness never left his eyes, but it was joined by a focus, a competence, a deep-seated knowledge that was as much a part of him as his scars. He was the mountain's student, and now he was making her one, too. One afternoon, he brought out his rifle, a long, heavy piece of dark wood and blued steel. "You need to know how to use this," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "To live here, you need to know." He led her outside, into the crisp, clean air. He explained the workings of the rifle with a simple, direct economy of words, showing her how to load the cartridge, how to cock the hammer, how to use the sights. Then he stood behind her to show her the proper stance. His sudden proximity was a shock that went through her entire body. He was a wall of solid warmth at her back, his large frame completely eclipsing hers, shielding her from the wind. The scent of him, pine smoke, clean sweat, and sawdust, filled her senses. He reached around her, his arms caging her in, his large, calloused hands covering hers on the stock and barrel of the rifle. The cold steel of the weapon was a stark contrast to the heat radiating from his body. "Breathe," he murmured, his voice a low vibration near her ear that made the fine hairs on her neck stand on end. "Let out half your air, then hold. Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it." His knuckles brushed against her cheek as he adjusted her grip. His breath stirred her hair. In that moment, the world seemed to shrink to the small space they occupied. There was no past, no town, no sorrow, only the solid weight of the rifle, the vastness of the wilderness before them, and the overwhelming presence of the man standing behind her. An unspoken, intense current passed between them, a longing so powerful and unexpected it left them both breathless. When she finally fired, the recoil jarring her back against his chest, she was shaking not from the rifle's kick, but from the raw, potent intimacy of the moment. He stepped back immediately after, a new, awkward tension hanging in the air between them, the space he had occupied now feeling cold and empty. The snow he had predicted arrived not as a gentle dusting, but as a brutal, wind-whipped deluge. An early, merciless winter descended upon the ridge, burying the world in a thick blanket of white. For days, the snow fell relentlessly, erasing the landscape, muffling all sound, cutting them off completely from the rest of the world. The cabin, once a symbol of her confinement, became their ark, a small, warm bubble of existence in a vast, frozen sea. The forced confinement, which should have been a trial, instead deepened the fragile bond between them. The long, dark evenings were spent by the fire. He would sit in his chair, a piece of wood in his hands, his knife moving with a fluid, mesmerizing grace as he coaxed a new creature from the grain. She would sit nearby, mending clothes or reading from one of the few books on his shelf. The silence was no longer empty. It was comfortable, filled with the soft scratch of his knife and the crackle of the flames. And in that warmth, he began to share his memories. It started with a single, quiet sentence. "Sarah," he said one evening, his eyes on the fire. "She used to hum when she stitched. Drove me half mad, but the cabin's too quiet without it." Ilara's needle paused in mid-air. He had said her name, not in the agony of a nightmare, but with a soft, aching tenderness. He did not look at her, just continued to carve. But he had opened a door into his past, and in the nights that followed, he began to let her step through it. He shared not the horror of their deaths, but the small, sacred beauties of their lives. He told her about his son, Daniel, who would make collections of pebbles and feathers, his pockets always bulging with small treasures. He described how Sarah's laughter used to sound, like wind chimes in the summer breeze. He spoke of the life they had built, the hopes they had nurtured in this very cabin. He was entrusting her with his ghosts, not the terrifying specters of their end, but the warm, beloved spirits of their time on earth. Listening to him, Alara felt her empathy bloom into a fierce, protective compassion. She was no longer just a witness to his grief. She was its keeper. Their isolated peace was shattered by a sound in the dead of night. It was a scream, a chilling, high-pitched cry that sounded unnervingly like a woman in terror. It echoed across the snow-covered landscape, raising the hair on Alara's arms. Elias was out of his bed in an instant, grabbing his rifle from its pegs on the wall. He stood by the door, listening, his body a statue of tense alertness. "Mountain lion," he whispered, his voice grim. "And it is too close." In the days that followed, the creature's presence became a constant, terrifying threat. They found its tracks, huge and menacing, circling the cabin. One morning, they discovered the half-eaten carcass of a deer not 50 yards from the door. The snow around it stained a gruesome red. The screams came every night, closer each time, a terrifying manifestation of the wilderness's ever-present danger. Elias explained that the animal was likely sick, rabid perhaps, which would make it fearless and unpredictable. The danger was no longer a distant possibility. It was stalking their doorstep, forcing them to rely on each other completely for survival. "It will try for the cabin soon," Elias said one morning, his face set in hard lines. "I have to track it, finish it." "It is too dangerous," Alara protested, a cold knot of fear tightening in her stomach. "It is more dangerous to wait for it to come to us," he countered. He checked his rifle, his movements economical and precise. "Stay inside. Bar the door. Keep the rifle I taught you with close at hand. Do not open the door for anything." He left, disappearing into the blinding white of the snow-covered forest, a solitary figure moving to confront the beast. The hours that followed were the longest of Alara's life. She paced the small cabin, the rifle feeling heavy and alien in her hands, her ears straining for any sound over the frantic beating of her own heart. The sound, when it came, was not the clean crack of a rifle shot, but a hellish symphony of snarls and a deep, human roar of effort and pain. It was close, too close, ignoring his command, her heart pounding with a terror that was entirely for him. She ran to the door and lifted the bar. Peeking through a small crack, she saw a scene of brutal, primal violence. The mountain lion, a lean and terrible engine of muscle and fury, had ambushed him. The two were locked in a life-or-death struggle in the snow. The lion was on his back, its claws tearing at his thick winter coat, its teeth snapping inches from his face. Elias roared, his arms locked around the creature's neck, trying to wrestle it away. It was a chaotic, bloody dance, and he was losing. Her training took over. The world narrowed to the small V of the rifle's sight. "Breathe! Let out half your air! Squeeze!" Her hands were shaking, her vision blurred by panic, but she saw a flash of tawny hide, a space between the beast and the man. She fired. The explosion of the rifle was deafening in the snow-muffled quiet. The mountain lion convulsed, a terrible shriek tearing from its throat. And then it slumped, its dead weight falling across Elias. For a moment, there was only a ringing silence. Then, Elias pushed the heavy carcass off him and slowly, painfully, got to his feet. He was bleeding from a dozen deep scratches on his arms and a long gash on his shoulder. But he was alive. He looked at her, his chest heaving, his face a mixture of shock and something she could not read. The ordeal had solidified them not just as companions, but as a team, as protectors of each other. That night, the adrenaline of the fight and the profound, overwhelming relief of being alive simmered between them in the fire-lit cabin. She had cleaned and bandaged his wounds, her touch gentle and steady, her fear for him overriding any awkwardness. Now, they sat in the charged silence, the dead lion a testament to the battle they had won together. He looked at her, and the look in his eyes was one she had never seen before, The grief was still there, a shadow in their depths, but it was joined by a raw, powerful emotion that stripped away all his defenses. It was gratitude, sharp and profound. It was awe at her courage, and beneath it all, there was a desperate, aching desire that mirrored the unspoken longing in her own heart. The emotional dam that had held back a winter's worth of pent-up feelings finally broke. He rose from his chair and crossed the small space between them in 2 long strides. He stopped before her, a giant of a man made vulnerable by his wounds and his emotions. Slowly, as if he were afraid she might bolt, he lifted a hand, his fingers scarred and calloused from a life of hard labor and artistry. He gently, tenderly, traced the line of her jaw, his touch a shocking, electric current on her skin. He whispered her name, his rough voice breaking on the single word, "Elara." It was not a statement, but a prayer, a recognition, a culmination of everything they had become to each other. He leaned down, and he kissed her. It was not a gentle, hesitant kiss. It was a kiss born of shared trauma and fierce loyalty, of nightmares and silent companionship, of a lonely winter and the violent, bloody relief of survival. It was fierce and desperate and deep, a claiming and a surrender all at once. It was the taste of wood smoke and pine, of sorrow and strength, of a life that had been saved and a new one just beginning. In his arms, Elara kissed him back with all the pent-up hope and fear in her own soul, realizing that this kiss in this cabin, at the edge of the merciless wilderness, was a promise not just of survival, but of life. The kiss was not an end, but a beginning. It unraveled the last threads of fear and mistrust that had lingered in the corners of their lives, and in their place, a tender intimacy began to grow, as quiet and as steadfast as the pines outside their window. The cabin, which had once felt like a cage to Elara, transformed. Its sturdy log walls no longer represented her isolation from the world, but her sanctuary within it. The hearth was not just a source of warmth against the cold, but the heart of a home they were hesitantly, carefully, building together. They became lovers in the deep quiet of the winter nights. Their connection was a language spoken without words, a profound communion that mended the broken places in their souls. For Elara, who had only known the selfish, bruising touch of a man who sought to own her, Elias's reverence was a revelation. His scarred hands, the same hands that could carve life from dead wood or face down a mountain lion, were impossibly gentle with her, mapping the lines of her body as if she were a precious, undiscovered country. He moved with a deliberate care, a quiet awe, as if he could not believe she was real. In his arms, she felt not possessed, but cherished. For Elias, after a decade of living in a frozen wasteland of grief, Elara was the coming of the spring. Her warmth thawed the permafrost around his heart. To touch her, to hold her, was to feel life rushing back into him, a painful, brilliant, overwhelming flood. It was a healing, a way of anchoring his drifting soul back to the world of the living. He communicated with his touch all the things his clumsy, disused voice could not: his gratitude, his burgeoning affection, his fierce, silent vow to protect this unexpected light in his life. The changes in him were subtle at first, then undeniable. The haunted, desolate look in his eyes began to recede, replaced by a soft, watchful tenderness whenever he looked at her. And one morning, as she was telling a rambling story about a stray dog she had known as a child in Philadelphia, a strange and wonderful thing happened. A slow warmth spread across the undamaged side of his face, crinkling the corner of his good eye. His lips, so often set in a grim line or twisted by his scars, curved upwards. He smiled. It was a small, hesitant thing, as rare and as beautiful as a wildflower blooming in the snow, and it struck Elara with such force that she faltered in her story, her heart filled with a sudden, fierce joy. His art transformed as well. One afternoon, he put aside the half-finished carving of a wolf and selected a large, flawless block of pale aspen wood. He spent hours just looking at it, turning it over and over in his hands. Then he began to carve, but he was not carving an animal. Ilara would watch him from across the room as he worked, his focus absolute. He would look from the wood to her, his gaze intense, studying the curve of her cheek, the line of her throat, the way a stray piece of hair fell across her forehead. The intensity that had once frightened her was now a source of profound comfort. It was the gaze of an artist studying his muse, and it made her feel seen in a way she never had before. He was carving her, capturing not just her likeness, but her spirit, her strength, the quiet resilience he saw in her. The sculpture became a testament to his reawakening, a symbol of the new life taking root in their mountain sanctuary. Their fragile peace lasted through the thaw and into the first green blush of spring. It was shattered by a knock on the door. It was Martha, the blacksmith's wife, her face pale and etched with worry. She had ridden a mule halfway up the mountain and walked the rest of the way, her skirts damp and muddy. "I had to come," she said, breathless. Accepting the cup of water Ilara pressed into her hands. "I did not want you to hear it from anyone else. There is talk in town, more than talk." From the folds of her shawl, she produced a folded piece of paper. It was a notice, printed in thick, black letters. Ilara's hands trembled as she took it. Her own name stared back at her. "A reward," Martha explained, her kind eyes full of pity. "Offered for information leading to the whereabouts of Miss Ilara Vance. A man came to town, from back east. He is handsome, well-dressed, and has a tongue dripping with honey. He says he is your fiancé. Philip, he says you were taken from your home, abducted by a savage, and that he has spent a fortune searching for you." Ilara's blood ran cold. The carefully constructed world of peace and safety she had built with Elias crumbled to dust around her. He had found her. The notice was a leash, thrown across 1,000 miles, and it was tightening around her throat. Elias, who had been standing silently by the hearth, took the paper from her shaking fingers. He read it, his expression hardening into a mask of stone. The name, Philip, seemed to poison the air in the cabin. "This is the man you ran from," he said. It was not a question. Ilara could only nod. A terrible, guttural sob building in her chest. The sight of his name, the knowledge that he was so close, brought all the old terror flooding back in a suffocating wave. "Tell me," Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He put his hands on her shoulders, forcing her to look at him, to see past her own fear to the unyielding strength in his eyes. "Tell me everything." And so she did, overcome with a terror that was bone deep. She confessed the full, ugly truth. She told him that Philip was not just abusive, but a monster of a different kind. He had never raised a hand to her in a way that would leave a visible mark, for he was too clever for that. His cruelty was a thing of the mind, a slow, meticulous dismantling of her soul. He took pleasure in her fear, in her humiliation. He would lock her in rooms for hours for some perceived slight, delight in telling her how worthless she was, how no one else would ever want her. He had treated her not as a person, but as a beautiful object he owned, to be polished and displayed when it pleased him, and to be locked away in the dark when it did not. "He will not stop," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He does not love me. He wants to possess me, to him. I am a thing that belongs to him, and he will never accept that I got away. He will drag me back, and he will punish me for daring to defy him." The tears came then, hot and unstoppable. Through them, she confessed the second, more fragile secret she had been holding close to her heart. "And there is more," she choked out, placing a hand on her still flat stomach. "Elias, I am with child, your child." She had known for weeks, a small, secret kernel of joy that she had been too afraid to share. She had seen the ghosts of his first family in his eyes and feared that the news of a new one would be a burden too heavy for his healing heart to bear. Now, the secret was a source of pure terror. The thought of Philip finding her, finding their child, was a horror beyond imagining. She watched him, expecting to see his face fall, to see the weight of this new responsibility crush him. But she did not see fear. She did not see anger. The sorrow in his eyes was burned away by a sudden, cold, protective fury. It was the most terrifying and the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. His grip on her shoulders gentled, and he pulled her against his chest, holding her tight. "He will not touch you," he vowed, his voice a raw growl. "He will not touch our child." He held her at arm's length, his gaze boring into hers, demanding that she understand. "You need to know," he said, his voice strained. "You need to know why I can promise you this. Martha told you my family was murdered, but she does not know how." He told her then the full, brutal details he had locked away for 10 years. He spoke of the smell of whiskey and unwashed bodies. He described the laughter of the men as they held him down, the searing, unimaginable pain as the hot iron met his skin. He recounted with horrifying clarity the sounds his wife and son had made, sounds that had been the fuel for a decade of nightmares. He had been forced to watch, to listen, to be aware of every single second of their agony, deliberately kept alive until the very end. "I did not die that day," he finished, his voice a hollow echo of the man who had suffered it all. "But I have lived in that fire every day since. I have already faced the worst that men can do. There is nothing your Philip can threaten me with that is worse than the memories I already carry. I would walk through that fire again 1,000 times before I let anyone lay a hand on you or this child. This is my vow to you, Elara." In that moment, their separate, jagged tragedies merged, forged together in the heat of his promise into a single, shared resolve. They were no longer two broken people hiding from the world. They were a family, and they would defend their right to exist. The next day, they began to fortify the cabin. The transformation was swift and grim. Their home, their sanctuary, became a fortress. Elias's intimate knowledge of the land, once used for hunting and foraging, was now turned to the art of defense. He was no longer just a mountain man. He was a soldier defending his last patch of ground. He showed Elara how to brace the doors and windows with heavy timbers. He scouted the surrounding woods, his eyes missing nothing, planning lines of sight and fields of fire. He dug pits along the main approach to the cabin, covering them with a thin lattice of branches and leaves. He set deadfalls, using heavy logs and woven vines, turning the beautiful, indifferent wilderness into a weapon. Elara worked alongside him, her terror channeled into a fierce, determined energy. She was not a damsel waiting to be rescued. She was a partner in their survival. She cleaned and oiled the rifles until they shone, her hands steady. She helped him move rocks to build a low wall along the front of the porch, creating a defensible barricade. She gathered and prepared their supplies, water, food, ammunition, with a focused efficiency. They worked mostly in silence, a grim, unspoken understanding passing between them. They were preparing for war. One evening, after a long day of hard labor, Elara could not find him in the cabin. A sliver of moon hung in the darkening sky, casting a pale, ethereal light over the land. She found him at the edge of the clearing, standing before two small, weathered wooden crosses that marked the graves of his wife and son. She had always given the spot a wide berth, considering it a sacred, private space of his sorrow. She stopped at the edge of the trees, hidden in the shadows, unwilling to intrude, but his voice carried on the still night air, thick with a grief that made her own heart ache in sympathy. He was speaking to them. "Sarah," he said, his voice a low, broken murmur. There is a woman. Her name is Elara. She is good and kind, and she is strong. She saved my life." He paused, his massive shoulders shaking. "And we are to have a child. A new baby will be born in our home." He reached out and rested a hand on one of the wooden crosses. I feel like I am betraying you. Loving her, loving this new life, I am so sorry. I never wanted to. I need you to know that I have not forgotten. Not for one moment." He choked on a sob. "I am asking for your blessing, for your permission to protect them, to be a husband and a father again." Ilara could bear no more. The sight of this powerful, resilient man, brought to his knees by guilt and memory, was heartbreaking. She stepped out of the shadows and walked quietly toward him. He did not hear her approach. She came to stand behind him and gently placed her hand on the middle of his broad, trembling back. He stiffened, then sagged, a long, shuddering breath leaving him. "Elias," she said softly, "new love does not erase old love. It cannot. It just makes the heart bigger. Loving me, loving our child. It does not dishonor them. It honors the life they shared with you and the heart that was good enough to love them so much." He turned slowly, his face silvered by the moonlight, wet with tears. The raw agony and conflict in his eyes was more than she could bear. Without a word, he reached for her, pulling her into a desperate embrace. He held her not as a lover, but as a drowning man holds a piece of driftwood, his face buried in her hair, his arms wrapped around her as if she were the only thing tethering him to the world. It was a moment of heartbreaking farewell to the ghosts of his past and a powerful, silent, all-consuming embrace of the future he would now fight and die for, to protect. Philip Armitage arrived in Redemption Creek like a prince visiting a pauper's village. He rode a fine black gelding with a silver-inlaid saddle and wore a tailored wool coat that shed the trail dust as if it were an offense. His boots were polished to a high shine, and his face was the kind of handsome that seemed out of place in the harsh, sun-bleached landscape. All clean lines, a charming smile, and eyes the color of a clear summer sky. He did not go to the boarding house. He took a room at the saloon, paying with a crisp bill that could have bought the entire establishment's supply of whiskey. He told his story to anyone who would listen, and everyone did. He spun a tale of tragic, stolen love, his voice a rich, cultured baritone filled with carefully modulated concern and heartache. He spoke of his beloved fiancée, Ilara Vance, a gentle, delicate creature, prone to flights of fancy. He described how she had been lured away, abducted by a monstrous figure from the mountains, a scarred and savage recluse known to the townsfolk as the Beast of the Ridge. He painted a vivid picture of her terror, her captivity, her desperate need for rescue. With his wealth and his smooth, confident words, he played upon the town's existing prejudice like a virtuoso. He was everything Elias Thorne was not: civilized, articulate, and comely. He confirmed their darkest assumptions, giving their bogeyman a specific and terrible crime. "I have spent a fortune on detectives, searching for her these long months," he announced to the rapt audience in the saloon, placing a heavy purse of coins on the bar. "And I will gladly pay a handsome reward to the brave men who will help me bring her back safely and deliver her captor to justice." The town, which had once scorned Ilara as a woman of questionable morals, now recast her as a tragic heroine, a damsel in distress. The whispers that had followed her down the dusty street transformed into a low growl of righteous indignation directed at the mountain. The men, who had once eyed her with crude speculation, now saw her as a prize to be reclaimed. With the added incentive of Philip's gold, Sheriff Brody, a man whose sense of justice was often outweighed by his pragmatism, saw the heavy purse and the determined set of Philip's jaw and made his decision. The law, in Redemption Creek, was about to be put up for sale. He pinned a notice to the board outside his office, calling for a posse to ride up to the Thorne homestead and bring back the girl. The town turned on Ilara and Elias, their judgment swift, absolute, and fueled by a stranger's lies. They were now enemies of the entire community. As the men gathered in the street, checking their rifles and cinching their saddles, one man stood apart. Abram, the blacksmith, a quiet man with powerful arms and a gentle heart, watched the proceedings with a growing unease. His wife, Martha, had told him of her conversation with Alara, of the fear and desperation she had seen in the young woman's eyes. Philip's story, so smooth and perfect, did not sit right with him. He had seen true grief, and the handsome stranger's performance felt hollow. He looked at the faces in the posse, men stirred up by greed and prejudice, their eyes alight with the thrill of a righteous hunt, and he saw a terrible injustice about to be done. Slipping away from the crowd, he went to his smithy, saddled his own sturdy mare, and rode out of town, taking a less traveled path. He was not a fighter, but he was a decent man, and he knew he had to warn them. Up on the ridge, the world was deceptively peaceful, but Elias, whose senses were attuned to the slightest changes in his environment, had felt the shift. He had seen the lone rider, Abram, approaching from a distance and met him at the edge of the clearing, rifle in hand. The blacksmith's warning came in a rushed, anxious torrent of words. "They are coming for you, Thorn, a whole posse, with the sheriff, that man, Philip. He has poisoned them against you." Just as Abram finished, the posse appeared, a dark line of riders cresting the trail below. There was no more time. Elias gave the blacksmith a hard, grateful look. "Get back! Get clear of this!" he ordered, before melting back toward the cabin. Philip and the posse reined in their horses just beyond the line of Elias's defenses. The sight of them, an armed and angry mob, sent a jolt of cold terror through Alara, but she stood her ground on the porch, Elias a solid, immovable presence at her side. "Alara, my love," Philip called out, his voice ringing with false concern. He dismounted, taking a step forward, his hand outstretched. "Thank God I have found you. Do not be afraid. I am here to rescue you from this monster." The moment had come. Alara felt Elias's hand find the small of her back, a silent offering of strength. She took a breath and stepped forward, placing her own hand protectively over her growing belly, a gesture that was both unconscious and a defiant declaration. "You are not here to rescue me, Philip," she called out, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the clearing with a strength she did not know she possessed. "You are here to reclaim your property, but I am not a thing to be owned." A murmur went through the posse. This was not the frightened, broken victim they had been led to expect. "This man," Alara continued, gesturing to Elias, "is my husband. He has shown me more kindness in a few months than you showed me in 2 years. The only monster here is you, Philip, a handsome, smiling monster who delights in the fear of others." She looked past him, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the townsmen. "He lies to you. He told you I was taken, but I ran from his cruelty, from his coldness, from a life that would have been a prison. I chose this. I choose this man." Philip's handsome face, for the first time, lost its carefully crafted mask of charm. It tightened, the skin pulling taut over his cheekbones, his blue eyes turning to chips of ice. The spell was broken. His public humiliation was complete. "You ungrateful wretch," he hissed, his voice no longer charming but venomous and low. He turned to the sheriff. "She is clearly terrified, her mind twisted by this beast. Get her and kill him if you have to." The confrontation exploded into violence. The first rifle shot, fired by the sheriff, splintered the porch railing next to Alara's head. Elias shoved her back into the cabin, and the world became a chaotic nightmare of noise and splintering wood. The siege was not a glorious battle, but a desperate, ugly struggle for survival. Elias was a ghost in the trees, never presenting a clear target, his knowledge of the terrain his greatest weapon. A rifle would bark from the line of riders, and a moment later, a shot would answer from an impossible angle, and a man would cry out as his horse went down, or a bullet tore through the flesh of his arm. Elias fought with a brutal, cold efficiency, aiming to maim, to disorient, to drive them back. Inside the cabin, Alara was a formidable force. The terror that had once paralyzed her was burned away, replaced by a mother's fierce, protective instinct. She moved from window to window, The second rifle braced against her shoulder. It struck a familiar weight. She did not fire wildly. She fired as Elias had taught her, with a calm, deadly precision. A man who tried to use the wood pile for cover was driven back by a shot that kicked splinters into his face. Another who tried to rush the side of the cabin fell, clutching a leg that would no longer hold him. They were a team, a two-person army fighting for their home, their future, their lives. Abram the blacksmith, caught between the two sides, spurred his horse forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Hold your fire," he bellowed, his honest voice a stark contrast to the cacophony of the fight. "This is wrong! You are being lied to!" Sheriff Brody, his face flushed with the heat of battle and his judgment clouded by Philip's gold, saw only an obstacle, a sympathizer aiding the enemy. "Get out of the way! Abram!" he yelled. But the blacksmith held his ground, trying to appeal to the men he knew, the men he worked with every day. "Listen to me," Abram pleaded. The sheriff raised his pistol, took aim, and fired. The shot was clear and sharp. Abram looked down at the dark, spreading stain on his chest, his face a mask of shocked disbelief. He swayed in the saddle for a moment, then pitched forward, hitting the hard ground with a sickening thud. A wave of horror washed over the clearing. The fighting faltered. This was not part of the plan. They had come to rescue a woman and subdue a monster, not to watch an innocent, unarmed man be shot down in cold blood. Elias saw it happen from his position in the trees. The death of the one man who had tried to help them filled him with a cold, terrible rage. He rose from his cover, deliberately drawing the posse's attention, his rifle spitting fire, providing a distraction to keep them from storming the cabin while they were disorganized. It was a heroic, reckless act. A volley of shots answered him. He felt a white-hot, tearing pain in his side and another in his shoulder. The world tilted, the trees spinning around him. He staggered, fired one last shot, and fell into the snow-dusted undergrowth. Philip saw him go down. This was his chance. Victory was at hand. He broke from the stunned and horrified posse, running for the cabin. He kicked the door open with a splintering crash. Elara was there, her face pale, trying to reload her rifle, her hands clumsy with shock and fear for Elias. He was on her in an instant, grabbing the rifle and tossing it aside. He seized her by the arms, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons, his handsome face contorted into a mask of triumphant rage. "I told you," he snarled, his face inches from hers, his breath foul with his own fury. "I told you that you could never escape me. You thought this brute could protect you? You are mine, Elara, you and whatever whelp you are carrying in your belly. You belong to me." He began to drag her toward the door. His victory absolute. Elara cried out, a sound of pure terror and despair, a single word torn from her soul.
"Elias."
Outside, lying in a spreading pool of his own blood. Elias heard her. Her cry cut through the fog of pain, a hook that snagged his soul and dragged it back from the brink. The image of her in Philip's clutches, the thought of that man's hands on her, on their unborn child, ignited a reserve of strength he did not know he possessed. It was a surge of pure, primal adrenaline. The ferocity of a husband and a father pushed beyond all limits. The men of the posse, still reeling from Abram's death, saw a figure rise from the trees. It was not a man who stood, but the beast of their legends, covered in blood and dirt, his face a ruin of old scars and fresh rage. Elias moved with a terrifying, unstoppable purpose. He ignored his grievous wounds, his legs carrying him toward the cabin in a lumbering, powerful stride. He burst through the doorway just as Philip was dragging Elara out. He did not speak. He did not roar. The sound he made was a low, guttural growl of pure, murderous intent. Philip, startled, shoved Elara aside and turned to face him, drawing a small, elegant pistol from his coat. He fired, but in his haste, the shot went wide. Elias was on him. The fight was not a fight. It was a storm, a whirlwind of savage, brutal force. It was the mountain's fury unleashed. Elias's massive hands closed on Philip, and the handsome man's civilized veneer was stripped away, revealing the panicked, terrified creature beneath. Philip's fists beat uselessly against Elias's chest. The struggle was short, bloody, and absolute. It ended with Philip on the floor, broken and whimpering, and Elias standing over him, his chest heaving, his body bleeding from a half-dozen wounds. He was a terrifying sight. Yet, in that moment, the men of the posse who had crowded the doorway saw him clearly for the first time. They had witnessed Philip's true, possessive cruelty. They had seen their own sheriff murder an innocent man. And now they saw Elias, not as a monster, but as a husband standing over the defeated form of a man who had tried to destroy his family. Slowly, one by one, the men lowered their rifles. Justice, raw and brutal and stripped of all pretense, had been served on the floor of the small log cabin. The siege was over. The world contracted to the space within the 4 log walls of the cabin. Outside, the posse departed. A somber procession taking with them a broken Philip Armitage and a disgraced sheriff, leaving the body of Abram the blacksmith to be carried home by his grieving friends. But inside, there was no thought for justice or retribution. There was only the shallow, ragged sound of Elias's breathing and the metallic scent of his blood. Ilara worked with a desperate, focused calm, tearing strips from her cleanest petticoats for bandages. She washed his wounds, her hands gentle but firm, revealing the terrible extent of the damage. His old scars, souvenirs of a past horror, were now crisscrossed with the fresh, raw geography of new ones. A bullet had torn through his shoulder, and another had gouged a deep furrow along his ribs. He was weak from blood loss. His powerful frame diminished, and for days he drifted in and out of a fevered haze, muttering the names of ghosts. In those long days and longer nights, Ilara did not leave his side. She was his nurse, his guardian, his anchor to the living world. She spooned broth and water between his cracked lips, kept the fire roaring to ward off the chill that seemed to seep from his very bones, and spoke to him in a low, constant murmur, telling him about the child growing inside her, about the future she refused to let go of. She was fighting a war not with rifles and fury, but with patience and a stubborn, unwavering love. Slowly, miraculously, he began to mend. The fever broke, and the light of consciousness returned to his eyes when he looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time since the fight. She saw a profound change. The haunted, restless sorrow that had always shadowed his gaze was gone. In its place was a new clarity, a deep, quiet peace, as if the violence had been a terrible exorcism, purging the last of the demons that had tormented him for a decade. The violence was over. The long, quiet work of healing had begun. A week after the siege, a small group of riders appeared at the edge of the clearing. Ilara's hand instinctively went to the rifle resting by the door, but Elias, propped up on his bed, put a hand on her arm. "It is all right," he rasped. It was a delegation from Redemption Creek. Martha, the blacksmith's widow, her face a mask of dignified grief, sat on a borrowed horse, accompanied by the general store owner and 2 other grim-faced townsmen. They dismounted and approached the cabin with the hesitant, heavy-footed gait of men walking to a gallows. Martha was their spokesperson. She stood on the porch, twisting her black gloves in her hands, her eyes finding Ilara's. "We, the town, we are shamed," she said, her voice thick but steady. "We let ourselves be blinded by a stranger's gold and our own foolish prejudices. We are the cause of Abram's death. He was a good man, the best of us, and he died trying to stop our madness." She looked past Ilara to where Elias was visible through the open doorway. "We cannot take back what was done, but we would like to make amends. Your home is damaged. We have lumber, and the men have willing hands. It would be an honor." Mr. Thorn, if you would allow us to help you rebuild, a penance of a sort. Ilara looked at Elias. His face was unreadable, a complicated landscape of old and new scars. For a long moment, he was silent. He could have turned them away, could have locked the door and embraced the bitter isolation they had earned. But he looked at Ilara, at her hand resting on her belly, and he made a choice. He chose a future for his son that was not defined by his father's bitterness. "We accept," Elias said, his voice still rough but clear. And so they came. In the days that followed, the men of the town worked on the homestead. They replaced the splintered porch railings, repaired the bullet-scarred walls, and mended the door that Philip had kicked in. They worked mostly in silence, a quiet, communal act of atonement. Elias, and by extension, Ilara, cautiously accepted their offering. They did not forget, but they chose forgiveness. A fragile bridge was built between the mountain and the town, constructed of shared grief and a mutual desire for redemption. Spring arrived, breathing new life into the high country. The snows melted, the creeks ran full and clear, and the wild columbines bloomed in their hidden patch. And in the cabin, as the world outside was being reborn, Ilara brought their son into the world. He was a healthy, beautiful baby, with a tuft of dark hair and his mother's determined chin. They named him Samuel, a good, strong name that meant heard by God. Ilara, exhausted, but filled with a love so vast it felt as if her heart would burst, watched as Elias approached the small cradle they had made. He looked down at the tiny, sleeping infant, his massive frame trembling. For a long moment, he just stared, his scarred face a canvas of a dozen warring emotions. Then, with a hesitant, reverent care, he reached down and lifted his son. He held the baby cradled in his huge, gentle hands. Against his chest, he looked into the small, perfect face of his child, a symbol of new life and impossible hope, risen from the ashes of all their violent yesterdays. And Elias Thorn, the silent man of the mountain, the man who had survived a living hell and sealed his heart in a tomb of grief, began to weep. The tears were not the silent, desperate drops of a man in torment. They were a flood, a final, cathartic release of a decade of loss and sorrow. He wept for the son he had lost and for the son he now held. He wept for the wife he had mourned and for the woman who had brought him back to life. He was not crying for the past, but for the overwhelming, heartbreaking beauty of the present. They rebuilt their life, not in defiance of the world, but in quiet coexistence with it. Their trips to town, once a source of dread, became a part of their routine. The townsfolk, forever sobered by the memory of Abram's death, treated them with a distant but profound respect. The whispers and cruel jokes were gone, replaced by quiet nods and averted eyes. Elias was no longer the beast of the ridge. He was Mr. Thorn, a quiet man who kept to himself but was known for his unyielding strength and his fierce devotion to his family. The mountain man and his wife were no longer outcasts, but a quiet, respected part of the fabric of the community. With his strength returned, Elias went back to his workshop. He picked up the carving of Ilara, which had sat untouched through the long ordeal. He worked on it for weeks, his hands moving with a new purpose, a new lightness. When he finally brought it into the cabin, it was finished. It was a masterpiece. He had captured her perfectly, her strength, her spirit, the gentle curve of her smile. But he had added something new. Held securely in her carved arms, nestled against her heart, was a tiny, perfectly rendered infant, their son, Samuel. It was a portrait not of a solitary survivor, but of a mother. It was a carving not of sorrow and resilience, but of enduring love and profound, familial peace. Years passed, quiet and gentle seasons turning one into the other. The cabin stood strong, the scars on its logs weathered by sun and snow until they were just part of its character. The world changed, But on the ridge, life held a steady, peaceful rhythm. One late summer evening, Elias and Alara sat on their porch, the air cool and smelling of pine. In the yard below, their son, Samuel, now a sturdy boy of 5, was chasing fireflies, his laughter echoing in the twilight. The land that spread out before them, once a place of tragic memories and a grim fortress, was now simply home, its beauty a comforting embrace. The 2 small crosses at the edge of the clearing were no longer a site of raw grief, but a place of quiet remembrance, a part of the history that had led them to this peace. Elias reached over and took her hand, his scarred, calloused fingers lacing through hers, their hands fit together perfectly, a testament to the life they had built. No words were needed. The comfortable silence that settled between them was more eloquent than any poem. It was filled with the shared memories of nightmares and thunderstorms, of mountain lions and whispered confessions, of a bloody siege and a quiet birth. They had been 2 outcasts, 2 broken people that nobody wanted, but together, they had faced down the darkness of the world and the deeper darkness within their own souls. They had fought and bled and healed, and in the heart of the merciless wilderness, they had built a life, finding not just a fierce and passionate love, but a profound and lasting redemption in each other. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.